Greetings, students. Welcome to Complexity Fuel. My name is Mr. Little, and today I'm looking at a rather humorous image of Vertumnus, which is a self-portrait of one of the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, created in 1591. Now, at first glance, this picture is actually really interesting because you'll quickly notice that while it is a portrait of a person, or it appears to be a person, it actually is made entirely of fruits and vegetables and other flowers, which makes it just a really interesting picture to kind of look at and pick apart over time. If you are a particularly astute observer, you might notice that some of the foods located in this picture are from the Colombian Exchange, or reached Europe through the Colombian Exchange, such as maize over here by the ear, and the breast being mostly out of a pumpkin gourd, or others such as peppers that came from the Americas. And so what's really interesting is that when we talk about the spread of food via the Colombian Exchange, we tend to talk about it in very revolutionary terms, like there was one single event that just drastically brought about all this change in food and dietary preferences. But it's actually not that simple. We're going to make that idea a little more complicated today. But before we talk about the spread of foods and other goods in Unit 2, what do you actually have to know about the spread of environmental goods between 1200 and 1450? Essentially, you have to be familiar with the ecological and environmental goods that went along trade routes. So specifically, you'll need to know about the Black Death, but you also need to know about a number of foods, including bananas, rice, and citrus. So we're going to talk a little bit about citrus today. Now, we often talk about the introduction of new foods as revolutionary, if you will. Historically speaking, there is such a thing as an agricultural revolution, which has a very complex definition, but when it gets down to it, it's actually very simple. An agricultural revolution is a fundamental change to the way humans produce sustenance and the amount of sustenance that is produced. Sustenance simply being food, whatever form that might take. If suddenly you have new ways to produce it and you produce more of it on a larger scale, that is considered roughly an agricultural revolution. Now, historically speaking, there have been three major recognized agricultural revolutions. So the first one was the with a capital THE, agricultural revolution, about 12,000 years ago, when humans first started to plant seeds for the first time. And the study of the agricultural revolution, why it happened, where it happened, is a field of study in and of itself, but suffice it to say, that's usually considered the first. Then there's another revolution that happens, and this is in Great Britain, and this involves new organization methods, as well as new crops and new tools, resulting in an increasing output of food in Great Britain. Then these practices were also spread to other parts of the world. Finally, there's what we call the Green Revolution, which occurred in the 20th century, and essentially was the use of chemical-based fertilizers, as well as oil or electrical-powered machines to make agriculture more efficient and produce more of it. This one actually occurred mostly outside of Europe and the Americas. It occurred in places like India, parts of Africa, and Mexico. These three big events are usually considered to be the major revolutions. But I want to talk about another one, because in the 1970s, a scholar named Dr. Watson argued that there was in fact another major agricultural revolution, which he called the Arab, and some other scholars have called the Islamic agricultural revolution, that occurred in the beginning in the 800s and then sort of lasting into the 14th century. The premise of this is that the rapid expansion of the Islamic world, the rapid expansion of the Caliphate and other Islamic states, resulted in the spread of new foods, the spread of new knowledge, and the spread of new technology, as well as the new demand for these food goods all over the Islamic world. If you look at this map of the spread of Islam, you can see that it actually incorporates a lot of previously disunited worlds, right? You have the Mediterranean, you have the Middle East, you have parts of South Asia and Central Asia. And that is essentially what Watson is arguing, that the rapid connection and unification of these areas under either a political or a cultural zone led to what we would consider an agricultural revolution. So specifically, Watson points out a few crops in particular, and he talks a little bit about the Mediterranean here, where he says, in the Islamic world, and by that he meant the Middle East and parts of the Mediterranean, the summer seasons was for all intents and purposes dead. Since, however, many of the new crops originated in the tropical regions of India, Southeast Asia, and Central Africa, they could be grown only in conditions of great heat. In particular, rice, cotton, sugarcane, eggplant, watermelon, hard wheat, and sorghum were all summer crops in the Islamic world. Essentially, what he's saying is that the introduction of new crops enabled a new growing season, which increased the amount of food being produced and increased the diversity of diets. He also points out that some of these foods had previously been considered rare oddities, if you will, or medicinal foods, right? You would take them when you were sick. And the diffusion of books and paper technology under the caliphates and throughout the Islamic world increased knowledge of some of these foods' applications as medicine. So he points out that the spread of text-based print also increased the demand and desire for these new foodstuffs. And in particular, the example you need to know for AP World was the spread of citrus plants into Europe, specifically in the southern Mediterranean, where citrus was initially somewhat viewed as a medical food, and then later on just became a nice flavoring in addition to one's diet. And you can see here from this medieval source book, it's actually translated from an Arabic manuscript, but it depicts growing of citrus fruits in parts of Europe. Now, at the same time, he points out that there was a lot of new technology that was not new in the sense that it had just been invented, but in the sense that it was old technology moved to a new place. Persian system of qanat, used in what is now Iran for many centuries, was moved into Iraq, and you see the construction of these underground waterways being built there. As I said before, the spread of books in the Islamic world also included agricultural manuals, and so knowledge of how to farm, cultivate, and harvest these foods also became much more common throughout the Islamic world and even found its way into Europe and parts of South Asia. However, this idea of an Islamic agricultural revolution is not without its critics. And this is a great reminder that history is an alive field and many people contest it. Watson's critics point out that he argued mainly using written sources, didn't actually do any archaeology himself. They also argue that he neglected to look and sort of really give credit to the pre-Islamic agricultural developments. And some of his critics are arguing that, in fact, Islamic practices built on existing Roman or Persian practices more so than Watson originally gave them credit for. And that's really interesting because it does sort of call into question even this whole concept of a revolution. And yes, we do have moments in history where everything changes at once, but how do we define a revolution? How narrow a time frame must something be, or how radical must it be in order for it to be considered a revolution? And that's what I think the debate about the Islamic agricultural revolution reminds us of. And as a sort of example of what some of his critics are talking about, there's this great picture from Spain where you have a water wheel that originates, these originated in parts of Iran and South Asia. They spread into Spain with the spread of Islam to Spain. But in this case, you have this water wheel right behind this Roman-built aqueduct. And so again, that question, right, is it the water wheel didn't replace the aqueduct? You needed both fundamentally to have this sort of vast increase in food output. So revolution or evolution? Really good question. So where would you use this information about the Islamic agricultural revolution and the debate over its validity and its impact? Any essay that talks about large-scale ecological change, a la the Colombian Exchange? Any essay that talks about the formation of large states, empires, or cultural zones? Or perhaps any essay that talks about the concept of revolution? If you have an essay with any of these topics, the example of the Islamic agricultural revolution might be a great way to make your essay just a bit more complex. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.